Hi there, and welcome to Does It Hold Up? A series where we look at older RPGs and compare them to today's efforts and see how they stack up. I read a lot about how such and such a game is classic or that this RPG is amazing for the time, and I wanted to play through some of these to see how true that is and give a review that someone who has never played them can use. Because if you haven't got nostalgia for it, then I find it hard to enjoy a game based on the excuse that it was made 25 years ago to be that compelling, honestly, especially when it comes to RPGs. Out of the many genres that exist, RPGs and visual novels, now that I think about it, have probably changed the least out of the many iterations of consoles and PCs that have been made over the years, especially when it comes to mechanics and stories. So if you take out graphics, it shouldn't be too hard to judge any RPG against any other. And boy, isn't Breath of Fire 3 a gorgeous game. I picked a right good one to use here as the prototype to try out my theory that any RPG can be as good as another if you don't consider graphics, didn't I? Alright, well, I messed that bit up, but we can salvage this. Despite what Wikipedia says about the game's fairly modest scores, Boffy, yes, I'll be using that, is very well regarded in the community of RPG sickos that I find myself in these days. Not least is the amount of and placing of the game on those top 10 lists that litter YouTube, like some RPG road hump for you to stub your metaphorical toe onto when studying your recommended feed. Yes, well. So for those who didn't know, Breath of Fire 3 is the third game in the series. And the first to make its way onto the PlayStation 1, all the way back in 1997 and made by Capcom, the Japanese company probably best known for Mega Man and Street Fighter, neither of which are RPGs. To give you an idea of what the RPG world was like back then on the PS1 in 1997, Final Fantasy VII had just been released at the beginning of that year. That's it. That's all you really need to know, right? Final Fantasy VII came out, sold 15 bajillion copies in Japan, and Capcom looked at that and went, I like money. 9 months later, Breath of Fire 3 was on the market. Hold on, I know that isn't actually what happened. I know it takes more than 9 months to make a game. I'm not that stupid. But let's be real here. Capcom would have seen the behemoth that is Final Fantasy VII, and they would have been influenced by it. They would be dumb not to be. So let's do a quick compare on these two and see if you can spot where Capcom chose to copy Squaresoft's work, shall we? First up, Square was using all of the PlayStation's graphical prowess in drawing polygons and being able to stream FMV sequences quickly via CD. Two things that were lauded at the time by reviewers to give the FF game a more cinematic experience. Did Capcom go for this too? No, they did not. Breath of Fire 3 does use polygons for its backgrounds and terrain generation, but the characters, those sexy sprite works that are lovingly designed and drawn, are not polygons. And thank the Lord, because back in 1997 we weren't ready for them. We just weren't. If the story beat where Barret gets his arm shot off in Final Fantasy VII had been sprite work instead of polygons, I probably would have looked at it like this, instead of like this. Okay, well, maybe it was the mechanics that Capcom was influenced by. I'm going to make a bit of a hot take here, but I actually think that Breath of Fire 3's mechanics are actually better than Final Fantasy VII's. In Boffy, you gain the ability to turn into a dragon, which will never not be cool. Sorry, Cloud, even cooler than you. But what really sets it apart is that you gain dragon genes throughout the game, which you can use to swap and change into different dragons, and you can even do fusions, just like in Dragon Ball Z. Now wait a minute there, Woodhouse, but what about the junction system? I hear you frantically type into your YouTube comment section because you can't help yourself. Yeah, it's better than the junction system. So you're going to learn one thing about me right here. I hate grinding. Can't stand it. And the only point when Final Fantasy VII's junction system gets interesting is late game, when you're grinding to go up against the weapon bosses. And you know what? It's boring. Man, it feels really good to say that. I love a lot of things about FF7, but watching a boss battle with Knights of the Round happening 17 times in a row is about as boring as it gets for me. No thanks. And whilst I admit that the enemy encounter rate is high in Breath of Fire, once you're in a battle, it's not very long before you're out again and walking around, bumping into stuff. More on that later. Alright, let's quickly get off this Final Fantasy VII tangent before all the Square apologists come after me with their keyblades. Where I think that Boffy steals its ideas from FF7 is in the minigames. FF7 is littered with them, and someone at Capcom probably thought that they could do this too, and decided to put in a bunch of busy work for you to enjoy. I'm not talking about fishing, by the way. I know that's been in Breath of Fire since the beginning. I'm talking about looking after fairies in their village, playing global hide and seek, augmenting your stats with masters, a tower crystal challenge that's basically just a time trial, wood chopping, and my personal favourite, walking around in the desert for hours and hours. So I think you can get my opinion on that. They took maybe the worst aspect of Final Fantasy VII and decided that they wanted to pollute their own game with it. For the most part, it's fairly harmless and doesn't affect your progress with the story, which is fine by me. But the desert section. The desert minigame could go jump off an Assassin's Creed tower so that I can move the hay bale at the last possible second and laugh as it dies! Anyway, it's a bad section. Use a guide for that bit. Not all the minigames are bad, however. There are quite a few dungeon puzzles that are the sliding tile variety that I enjoyed. These usually happened in a room where encounters were turned off, so I might have just been riding the high of being able to move 12 feet without being mugged, but I did like doing them. I like that they break up the monotony of fighting enemies, which makes me wonder where they are in modern games. Recently I've noticed that this doesn't happen, and that's especially true in Western games. I wonder if this is just due to time constraints. Anyway, I enjoyed these. The only times I didn't enjoy the puzzles was when they were timed. Every time I had to sprint to an object and interact with it before a timer ran out, I feared I would lose my mind, and this brings me to one of my major gripes with the game. It was made before DualShock Analog was a thing. So before we had DualShock controllers for the PlayStation, the controller was just a D-pad and buttons, so there was no analog movement available, and Breath of Fire 3 was designed with this in mind, I guess. So even though the game takes place in a 3D world on a 3D plane, when you press left on the D-pad, you go left as if the game takes place on a flat 2D world, not a 3D one. So when the game is constantly asking you to line up with objects to activate them properly, and in some cases with a time limit, you're going to try and origami your fingers into the right position as you try to go in diagonal, which doesn't always happen. You'd think that little Ryu's thighs would be of gargantuan proportions by now, since he always seems to be going up and down ladders even when I don't want him to. Bringing up our hero though, I should probably talk about the story and writing in the game, shouldn't I? Since we're about 10 minutes into this video. Alright, so you take control of Ryu, a baby dragon who has been awoken into a world where dragons haven't existed for hundreds of years, who also has the ability to look like a human, so he can blend in. Without any idea of what's going on, you find yourself going from place to place, trying to figure out who you are and where the other dragons went, whilst exploring the many different places and people that make up this world. I think it's a pretty good one too. There are various different vistas and climates that are shown to our player, and all of the dialogue is maturely written. Sometimes too maturely for a game that claims it's suitable for 3-year-olds on the box. Our playable characters have realistic motivations and get angry and act irrationally when the world turns against them. Which happens all the time here, by the way. In this world, adults are dicks, and the story is better for it. With the way the dungeons, mechanics and writing style all act together, I'd actually compare this game to a Persona, or something along those lines. Without the complex monster fusion or social links that Persona uses to set itself apart, but the foundation of the RPGs are actually quite similar in my opinion. It's not all sunshine and rainbows though. There are several aspects of the game that simply don't respect your time, that do drag it down a little unfortunately. As I said before, the encounter rate is quite high, meaning you can't walk very far without some monster wanting your autograph written in your own crimson unless you cave their head in first, which at times can become very tiresome. I get it, the game has lots of spells and abilities for you to try out, so that means lots of battles for you to experiment in. I just feel that grinding should be something that you opt into in games, to make a boss easier if you're struggling perhaps, not the norm that must be adhered to. There are also certain abilities that your characters have that will allow them to move through terrain obstacles that have been set up, meaning that if you don't have that character in your party, you will have to leave the dungeon, change your group around, and go all the way back with those same encounters again. There's one specific instance near the end of the game where a character I hadn't used for the majority of it was needed to progress the story, and I wasn't able to remove them until that section was complete. Meaning I had to grind Ray the Tiger Boy here for 10 levels or so, just so he could be useful to me in battle. All that aside, however, I did enjoy the 50 hours I put into Breath of Fire 3. For 2/3 of the game, I used a guide, mainly to show me which way to go in dungeons and strategies with bosses, which made my frustrations a lot easier to deal with. Feel free to comment on how much weak sauce I am for using one, but you do what you gotta sometimes to make the game fun. and I figured that would be more fun dealing with lots of monsters but still knowing which way to go. So, does Breath of Fire 3 hold up? Well, yes, for the most part I think it does. Whilst its mechanics are nothing extraordinary, they aren't exactly light years behind what we see today in modern RPGs, and its story is well written and deals with all kinds of mature themes that were sometimes odd to see, but they made me pay attention and seek them out. And of course, that sprite work is pretty damn amazing, even now. I know I said I wouldn't judge a game based on its graphics, but these sprites are pretty damn special, aren't they? If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, comment below and what you would like to see me look at next. If you think I'm full of it and wrong, comment below and subscribe. You're going to hate what I do next even more. Ciao!